Welcome to episode 91 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on December 26th, 2022. We are starting a new season of the podcast today, Season 8. Welcome. And they said it wouldn't last. I don't know who they were, but it doesn't really matter now, does it? Today, we are going to be focusing in on another fiber type, this time alpaca and the other camelid fibers indigenous to the Americas. Before we begin, I have a bunch of folks to thank for becoming patrons of the podcast over at patreon.com/IThoughtIKnewHow. Warm thank yous go out to Donna, Mary, Carolyn, and Marion for supporting the podcast. Thank you to you and to all of you who support the show. One of the benefits for those who support the show at the $5 and higher levels are the online knitting times. The dates for the first quarter knit-alongs have been posted on the Patreon feed, so check those out and mark your calendars, and I hope to see you there. Let's talk alpaca, shall we? And really, we are going to be covering all of the camelid relatives that developed here in the Americas. The first time I visited Peru, I was just in the very beginning, budding stages of yarn snobbery. I bought most of my yarn in big box stores, and when I really wanted to splurge, I'd head to Webb's and shop in their warehouse, because price was undoubtedly my guiding feature for choosing yarn at that time in my life. And as a result, from time to time, I would put a lot of work into making something only to find that the yarn I used was not suited to the purpose, and then would just not use the item as a result. I hadn't realized yet that yarn was different in more ways than color and feeling. I understood the softness spectrum, and that was about it. Not that different fibers actually behaved differently once they were washed, or that they stood up to wear differently, or that they had different memories to them. I certainly didn't understand that with a little research, I could understand why the scarf I knit didn't soften up when it was washed, even when I added conditioner to the wash water like the internet tells you to, or why the sweater ended up a tunic after I had washed it. So when I got to Peru and spoke with someone who was selling things made from alpaca, and I referred to it as wool, I did not understand their huffy reaction that it was not wool, it was alpaca. It took me a few times to sink in that I was consistently being corrected. That shawl is not wool, it's vicuña. That coat is not wool, it's llama. Those experiences are actually what flipped the switch for me to start thinking about why it mattered what animal the fibers came from. And I fell down the rabbit hole of wool versus alpaca versus cotton versus acrylic, and all the variations within those species, and most importantly, why it matters to me as a knitter. If you've just found the podcast, I'll encourage you to look back at the other deep dive episodes I've done for other fibers. Today, we are going to focus on the fibers of the South American camelids. All of the animals we know of as camelids got their start in North America millions of years ago as a small mammal about the size of a golden retriever. The family branched out, with one branch of the family crossing the Bering Land Bridge into Asia, where they evolved into what we think of when we think of camels. Another branch migrated south to South America, where they became the South American camelids, alpaca, llamas, guanacos, and vicuñas. Incidentally, the camelids that remained in North America were extinct by the end of the last ice age due to climate changes. The South American camelids do not have humps like their Old World cousins. They do have long necks, though, as well as being semi-ruminants with soft padded feet, and they all produce fiber we can use in crafting. Many of them are double-coated to varying degrees. Their guard hairs are hollow, which can make them more insulating, but also makes them thicker and more likely to be prickly. So the fleeces either need to be prepared before spinning to remove the guard hairs, or the resulting yarn needs to be used for a suitable purpose. So for instance, camel, with the guard hairs left in, can be a very durable yarn and be used to weave strong halters and bands and rugs, or felted and used to make coats, while camel hair with the guard hair removed can be as soft as cashmere. The South American camelids have, over time, been bred to have fewer guard hairs than their Old World cousins. From the camelids that moved into South America, the vicuña and guanaco developed and continue to exist as wild populations even today. The vicuña are smaller and live at higher elevations than the guanaco. Vicuña have the finest fiber of the South American camelids, coming in at as fine as 13 microns, which is as fine as the finest available cashmere. Before the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the fiber was only worn by royalty, and now the vicuña is featured on the national coat of arms for Peru, where most vicuñas still exist in the wild. Vicuña fiber is extremely expensive for several reasons. The first is that they can only be shorn every 3 years because their hair grows very slowly. Even after 3 years, the staple length is usually less than 2 inches. And since they are still wild, that means embarking into the wild with the hopes of catching them to shear them. Despite their large dark eyes and slight build, they are very good at defending themselves, and they will rear up and counterattack against any attempts to capture them. I have seen vicuña in captivity at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Peru. They are very fine-boned and reminiscent of deer, though they have a very different bone structure to them. Still, my thought was that they looked like they would accept some affection from a passing tourist, just like a deer that has been acclimated to people would. But the warning from our tour guide and the fact that he wouldn't get anywhere near the double fence designed to prevent people from reaching the vicuña, that was enough to convince me to heed his warning and stay back. With their highly valuable hair that grows slowly, and the fact that they resist capture, you can imagine the kind of incentive this sets up to just kill the animal rather than catching them to shear them. It's estimated that there were roughly 2 million vicuña in South America before the Spanish arrived. The Incas had an organized system in place to be able to continue to benefit from the animals. They would literally gather thousands of people together who would stand around a certain area up to 100 miles across and move inward toward one another until all the vicuña in the area were gathered into a tight herd and surrounded, where they would then be singled out to be shorn and released. Such was the organizational power of the Incan Empire. For the Spanish and other Europeans who followed, vicuña fiber was a way to make a quick buck, and it was much easier to shoot the animal and take the most valuable fiber from the corpse than it was to hire 1,000 locals and spend days to capture them and shear them. By the 1960s, there were only 6,000 or so of them left in the wild, and they officially became a protected species in 1974. A nature conservatory was founded to preserve them, and over a dozen men from Peru and Bolivia were trained as wardens to prevent vicuña poaching. People were no longer allowed to shear them or trade in their fiber at all, and the species has rebounded to about 250,000 animals. Now, there is an officially organized shearing event yearly in Peru, not unlike what was done in ancient times. Other countries also have methods in place for the shearing. The fiber is sold at a price of about $300 per kilo on the world market. Even now, while the vicuña is no longer listed as endangered, it is still a protected species, and it is illegal to transport vicuña out of their native countries. There are Paco-Vicuna that exist outside of South America, and we'll talk more about them later, but true vicuña are still just in a handful of countries in South America. Vicuña fiber is naturally reddish-brown or light tan in color. Because of its short staple length, it pretty much has to be woolen spun. And because it's so expensive, it tends to only be processed in lace or fingering weight yarns. However, it's almost always processed into finished goods before being sold. It's nearly impossible to find as a pure vicuña yarn, though small percentages are sometimes blended into other yarn, and spinners can sometimes find vicuña fiber for spinning. If you do manage to get your hands on some pure vicuña, you'll have more success knitting it into stockinette, garter, or simple knit purl patterns. The fiber is so downy and it doesn't have much memory to speak of, so lace and more complex patterning would lose distinction over time. Guanaco live in the high plains of South America, but at lower elevations than the vicuña. They exist in larger numbers in Chile and Argentina, though they're also found in the bordering countries of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. They are wild, but they are more tameable than vicuña, if you can catch them. They can run up to 35 miles per hour, basically from the time they are born. Guanaco can be roughly 3 times heavier than a vicuña. There are about 2 million guanaco in the wild, and so they've never been a protected species, though before the Spanish arrived, it's estimated that the native population was upwards of 30 million. It's also legal for them to be sent overseas, so chances are good that you've seen them in a zoo somewhere. They have light brown bodies with white on their tummies and legs, and often have dark faces. While they're much larger than the vicuña, they still only produce about half a pound of fiber each year. Their fiber is about 19 to 24 microns, which puts it at about the same micron count as merino. But again, it's a very fine fiber with very little crimp to it. So if you find some guanaco to use, you'll want to knit something with very simple patterning. Some sources say it can handle basic open work stitches, but I personally think I'd stick to stockinette or a supported stitch. More on that later. So those are our wild South American camelids. We'll take a break and then take on the domesticated breeds. So grab your knitting if you don't already have it. Here's a calm 3 minutes for you with Smiling You from Ray's Factory. I'm just in the mood for a calm start to the new year. That track really hit the spot for me. Let's carry on though. Alpaca and llama are the domesticated forms of vicuña and guanaco respectively. This has been determined through genetic testing. Vicuña and guanaco tend to come in a very narrow range of natural colors, while alpaca and llama have more varieties of shades. They also tend to produce more fiber each year. That said, alpaca fiber tends to be thicker than vicuña, and llama fiber tends to be thicker than guanaco. However, there is some overlap in the range of fineness between the domesticated animals and its wild predecessor. And the discovery of a large number of mummified alpaca and llama shows that the pre-Spanish animals produced finer fibers than their modern counterparts, likely because of the effect of both a more limited breeding pool and the loss of the organized breeding efforts that were part of the Incan economy. So again, alpaca are domesticated versions of vicuña. Alpaca are only slightly larger at the shoulder than vicuña, but their average weight is about 50% heavier, and they produce far more fleece than their wild counterpart, with their yearly fleeces weighing in at 5 to 10 pounds compared to vicuña's pound or so every 3 years. Alpacas are generally kept at lower altitudes than the vicuña, and the same alpaca can produce varying qualities of fleece each year on its body. There are 22 recognized natural shades of alpaca, and there are 2 types of alpaca, the huancaya, which are the fluffier version of the animal and tend to be what people think of when they're talking about alpaca because they make up over 90% of the alpaca in the world, and the Surrey alpaca, which have those long locks. The huancaya is now more prevalent, but it's believed to have been the other way around before the Spanish came to South America. After they arrived, most of the alpaca breeding continued in higher altitudes away from the invaders, which was better suited to the huancaya's thicker, fluffier coat. Both animals produce soft fibers. Neither has much guard hair to speak of. And for our purposes as knitters, their yarns are similar enough that you could use them interchangeably. Spinners might be more interested in trying a Surrey fleece for the experience of working with such a long staple length and because it can be tricky to add the right amount of spin to it. Huancaya fibers tend to be in the 2 to 6 inch range, while Surrey can grow up to 11 inches of fiber in a year. Generally speaking, alpaca fiber is heavier than wool, which means it tends to be drapier. It also has virtually no memory. More on that later when we talk about how to use camelid fibers to their best effect. It can be combed or carded before being spun, so it's possible to have a fluffier or a sleeker appearance to your finished project depending on its preparation. On to llama. Llama are still used as pack animals in South America. They can be roughly 50% taller than some alpaca and up to twice as heavy. I find that llama fiber has a reputation for being coarse, which it certainly has the potential to be, but with an average thickness of 20 to 30 microns, it still falls in the range of being fine enough that many people can wear it against their skin. But the fleeces of llama can be highly variable in quality from animal to animal. They also tend to have multicolored fleeces, and they tend to trap a great deal of vegetable matter in their fleeces. Take all of this together, and it means it can be harder to process a consistent llama yarn for commercial purposes. You rarely find 100% llama yarn outside of South America. Outside of its native region, it tends to be blended with wool or other camelid fibers when you can find it at all. One benefit of llama fiber is that of all the camelids, it has the best memory. It's still not perfect at retaining its shape, but it sometimes has a decent amount of crimp to it, which helps. More on this later. Paco-Vicuna is a North American invention, I guess you could say. I mentioned before that it's illegal to take vicuña out of their original countries in South America. However, because alpacas are descended from vicuñas, they naturally have similar traits. And because from time to time there is still interbreeding between the two, there are some alpacas that are noticeably more like vicuñas. The Switzer family of Colorado went to Chile with the express goal of finding these alpaca with similarities of fineness, color, and bone structure to vicuñas. Through genetic testing, they were able to show authorities that they were actually alpaca and therefore could be exported, and they brought the animals back to the U.S., where they began a selective breeding program to encourage the more vicuña-like traits in their offspring. At this point, there are still fewer than 1,000 Paco-Vicuna in the United States, but they have been able to breed animals that produce fleeces in the 13-micron range while the animal is still young, with staple lengths of about 3 inches. Not every Paco-Vicuna meets that standard. There are 6 types recognized at the moment. Type 6 is more alpaca-like, and type 1 is more vicuña-like. And overall, the micron count ranges from 12 to 26 microns, with animals that need to be shorn every 1 to 3 years to produce the 3-inch sapal. Genetically speaking, Paco-Vicuna are alpacas. It's not accurate to refer to them as vicuñas, and those who are raising Paco-Vicuñas should be referring to them either as alpacas, Paco-Vicuñas, or vicuña-like animals to cover their bases when it comes to truth in advertising. But it is accurate to say that the Switzers have been able to successfully breed some of them to express the more primitive traits of their vicuña ancestors. I have been cleared by my husband to pick up a spinning wheel, so pick up a spinning wheel I shall, and I'll be turning to Knit New Haven to do so. I talk about Knit New Haven as a knitter's destination, but the truth is that they meet the needs of lots of fiber crafters, including spinners. They are currently shacked dealers, and aside from the wheels themselves, they carry plenty of fiber to keep us spinning. I have my eye on a match list, but I'm still weighing my options. If you are in the market for a wheel, contact Knit New Haven and talk over your options. Visit knitnewhaven.com for contact information. In just the last few months over in the Morehouse Merino Flock Group, there have been classes for a shawl, a hat, and thrummed socks, all with ongoing support and instruction, all included in the cost of your membership. Also included are Woolly Book Club gatherings and community support, including social knitting times online. Learn more and join the club over at morehousemerinoflock.com. The second Contemporary Crafts Week of the Macking Our Way Through Shetland Tours has only a few spots left. The tour takes in 6 lessons with talented makers from across Shetland, and if you'd like, you could come early or stay later and arrange for additional knitting lessons. Learn more about the tour by visiting IthoughtIKnewHow.com and clicking the link in the header to Shetland Tours 2023. It's been a while since I've talked about Woolland, but I've been wearing a lot of my Woolland items over the last few months. If you haven't had a look lately, now is the time. There are several new styles, including the Renata with 3/4 length bell sleeves, and the Penny Wrap dress, which will release later this month, that's made with 69% cotton, 31% wool denim. That's just 2 of their newer cuts that I have my eyes on. Use the link in the show notes to check out their extended lineup of styles, and if you do end up making a purchase, a percentage of your purchase price will help support the show at no additional cost to you. Thank you for your support of the sponsors of the show. As we talk about these different South American camelid fibers, it's important to note that how it is labeled depends on where you are getting the fiber from. In the US, if it's fiber from an alpaca animal, it will be labeled as alpaca. If it's from a llama, it should be labeled as llama. However, in South America, there are several different classification systems, and they name the fiber based on the fineness of the fiber, not based on the originating animals. I suspect that the reason this is the case is because of one of the realities of raising camelids in South America, and that is that it's often done by the poor who cannot afford to fence in their flocks. As a result, many camelid raisers do not have full control over which animals breed with each other. Flocks intermingle, species crossbreed. As a result, many of the small-scale breeders do not have pure alpacas or pure llamas. They have what are called wari, or crossbreeds. Those that are more alpaca-like are called Paco-wari. Those that are more llama-like are called llama-wari. But this is just based on appearance and not necessarily reflective of the actual percentage of each species based on genes. So rather than excluding the fiber that comes from these hybrid animals from the marketplace, the fleeces are labeled according to their fineness. And camelid fiber that is in the 28 micron or less range is sold as alpaca. Anything in the 29 or higher micron range is sold as llama. First clips tend to be the finest the animal produces, and so if it comes in the low 20 range, it's sold as baby alpaca. Some marketers have further delineated anything in the 19 micron or less range as being royal, in reference to the pre-conquest alpaca, which came in at 18 microns, which you will remember is as soft as the finest cashmere and was reserved for royalty. There is a benefit to this system in that even the poorest animal raiser still has access to the marketplace even if their animals are hybrids. It also gives the consumer a sense of how fine they can expect the fiber to be. The downside is that there is a difference in these animals' fibers and how they behave apart from their fineness. So a knitter may expect their alpaca or llama yarn to behave one way and find it doesn't meet their expectations. My suggestion is to check the label for the originating country, and if it's from one of the South American countries, judge by feel and have looser expectations. Be sure to swatch and wash the swatch to see how it behaves before you commit to how you will use it. This takes us into how to care for the fiber of South American camelids. For the most part, as a protein fiber, you can care for it the same way you would care for wool. To wash it, soak it in a lukewarm or cool water bath with a mild detergent. Agitate it gently, if at all. These fibers will felt, so minimal to no agitation is best. It is very important to support camelid fibers when removing them from the water. They have basically no memory. Unlike wool, you cannot smush them into shape and expect them to stay that way when they dry. When you are done washing the project, let the water out of the tub or sink. Mash as much water out of it as you can against the side of the container, and then completely support the project from below as you lift it to a waiting towel. Squeeze out as much water as possible. Gently position the project into shape and allow it to dry completely, and then wait another day or two to be sure it's fully dry before moving it. If I sound like I'm being emphatic, it is because I have learned through hard experience that alpaca and other camelid fibers do not behave like most wools. You need to use wisdom in choosing your projects. I thought I was being very wise with one project. I had heard that alpaca will get longer and longer on you over time, so I knit a scarf, thinking that it wouldn't matter if a scarf got longer. I also made it with cables, thinking that the periodically crossed cables would help it keep its shape. By the time the scarf was done being knit, not even blocked, just knit, it had grown a foot longer than it should have been. After blocking, it gained another 2 feet. At that point, I just completely unraveled it and reknit the yarn into a herringbone cowl that crosses in front and buttons in place. The nature of the herringbone stitch is that it basically crosses all the stitches every other row. That project has not grown because the stitch pattern has pretty much locked it in place. But I cringe anytime I see 100% alpaca socks or sweaters or hats or gloves knit in a simple stockinette pattern, because I know whoever has knit it or bought it is going to get 1 or 2 wears out of it before it starts to grow. Choose your patterns wisely when working with camelid fibers. Using finer yarns will help, as the overall project will be lighter and less likely to stretch under its own weight. It's also helpful to knit something that has seams, because those seams can add some support as well. Be sure that you are knitting it at the optimal gauge. My suggestion is to knit camelid fibers at a gauge that is just looser than stiff. It should have some drape to it. You don't want it stiff as cardboard, but not much more movement than that. Pick patterns that have dense stitch patterns that support the project shape, or choose slouchy styles that will benefit from additional slouchiness over time. If you want to knit a sweater, make sure you plan for it to add inches over time. Now's a great time to knit a crop sweater. They're very stylish right now, and by the time cropped sweaters are passé, your sweater will be long enough to cover your hips. 2 styles for the price and effort of 1. Tailored pieces, projects that need to hug a shape like gloves or socks. If you want to knit those with a camelid fiber, I strongly recommend that you go for a wool camelid blend so that the garment has some memory and can hold its shape. You'll get the extra warmth and drape and softness of the camelid fiber with some structure from the wool. I shared a story at the start of this episode about how I was constantly corrected in Peru when I referred to alpaca as wool. It is still very common to hear any protein fiber called wool, but different animals produce different types of fibers that behave in different ways. In Peru, the camelid growers wanted the distinction made between their soft, drapey fiber and the loftier wool of their area, which rather unfairly has a reputation for being prickly. Micron counts for the highland wool of the Andes is comparable to what is sold as alpaca and llama fiber, but the latter is touted as being soft while the former is disparagingly called itchy. Still, the fibers do behave differently and they are better suited to different uses. Several sources I used as I prepared this episode referred to the camelid fibers as wool, but a few did make the point that it was more proper to refer to it as hair. In Peru, I was told to refer to it as fiber or by the name of the animal. I'm happy to do either. Producers should have a say in how we refer to their product, especially when there is a whole list of differences between the stereotypical wool and the stereotypical camelid. So as we wrap up this deep dive into South American camelids, I'd encourage you to do the same. Refer to these camelid fibers as fiber rather than wool, or be more specific and call them by the source animal's name. I have another song for you as we approach the end of the show. This is another from Ray's Factory called Path. Enjoy. A few more things before I go. The Yarn Stash Restash event is going on Instagram. It's designed to be a gradual, gentle, judgment-free process. You can see the daily prompts for that and work along with everyone else. And at the end of the 2 weeks, have a stash that feels bright and fresh and new again. We are over a week into the process by the time this will go live. But when I say this is a gradual, gentle process, I mean it. There is still time to catch up or just take it at your own pace. There are 3 prizes for participants just to add a fun side to the event. To qualify to win one of the prizes, make an Instagram post for each prompt you finish and use the hashtag YSRestash. That's the letters YS and the word restash. And I'll pick 3 winners at random from all the posts that use that hashtag on January 9th, 2023. Winners in the U.S. will have their prize mailed immediately. If you are outside of the U.S., your prize will be mailed at the end of January because the postage price difference between the U.S. and the U.K. really is that dramatic. Second thing, I have no New Year goals. I am freeing myself from that burden entirely this year. I have nothing against resolutions. You might remember I have set goals in past years, but I am just not in the mood for them this time. I am going to try to get through some of the half-finished projects in my project bags during January. I'm going to try to get a few patterns out that I've been working on in 2022 and just haven't finished writing up. I'm going to try to be more mindful of gift knitting throughout the year and have set a recurring reminder on my phone to help make that happen. I'm going to try to get to the point where I work during work hours and then stop working for the day. So I don't have resolutions or goals. I have try-tos. We'll see how that goes. For now, though, it's time to wrap up. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you'd like to support the show, check the show notes for ways to make that happen. Special thanks to all of my patrons, to Knit New Haven and to Morehouse Farm for sponsoring the podcast. The show notes are also where you will find links to any reference materials I use as I prepared the show, so be sure to check those out. Find me on my social media accounts as I Thought I Knew How, except on Twitter, where it's just Thought I Knew How. The groups on various platforms are all called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.